The moment the words "ears investigation" and Meghan Markle were spoken in the same breath, the fairy tale didn't just crack, it shattered so violently that even Buckingham Palace couldn't pretend it didn't hear the echo. Because this wasn't just gossip whispered behind palace walls anymore. This was federal power knocking at the door of a duchess who once ruled headlines with effortless charm. This was the moment when whispers of manipulation, branding deception, and royal exploitation turned into something darker, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. And as cameras rolled across London on that fateful February morning, the royal machine did something it almost never does. It publicly stepped away, creating a distance so sharp, so deliberate, it felt less like silence and more like abandonment. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the air outside Marlborough House wasn't just cold, it was electric. Prince William stood there, composed, unshaken, but behind his calm expression was something unmistakable: resolve. He wasn't just speaking as a brother anymore, he was speaking as the future king. And when he declared that the crown does not endorse, finance, or associate itself with Archewell Foundation or its subsidiaries, it wasn't just a statement, it was a severance. It was the kind of public distancing that royal insiders describe as irreversible, because once the palace draws a line like that, it doesn't erase it, it fortifies it. But why now? Why, after years of silence, years of strategic avoidance, years of pretending that Meghan's ventures existed in a separate orbit? The answer arrived like a sealed envelope stamped with authority. The ears had officially requested cooperation from the royal household. Yes, the same ears that dismantled empires, that crushed untouchable figures, was now examining Archewell Foundation with surgical precision. They wanted answers, they wanted records, and most terrifying of all, they wanted to know whether Meghan Markle had used the crown itself as leverage. Because here's what changed everything. At a prestigious forum in Aspen, Meghan had spoken words that sounded innocent, almost poetic, but beneath the surface, they carried dangerous implications. She described Archewell as representing a legacy of service instilled by the crown. That single phrase, legacy of the crown, would later ignite suspicion, because it suggested something the palace insists never existed: official royal endorsement. And in the world of nonprofits, perception isn't just power, it's currency. Behind palace walls, alarms had already been ringing. Warnings had been issued quietly. Emails had been sent. Advisories had been drafted. But Meghan didn't slow down. Instead, she expanded. She launched American Riviera Orchard, a lifestyle brand drenched in royal aesthetic. The packaging wasn't subtle. Stylized crowns, elegant serif fonts eerily similar to Buckingham Palace communications, phrases dripping with heritage, legacy, and royal symbolism. It wasn't just branding, it was theater. It was an illusion carefully constructed to make consumers feel like they weren't buying jam or tea, they were buying a piece of royalty itself. And for a while, it worked. Headlines praised her reinvention. Fans applauded her independence. The narrative was flawless. The duchess who escaped the monarchy and built her own empire. But behind the scenes, something far more fragile was unfolding. Because numbers don't care about narratives. Numbers expose truth. Archewell's financial disclosures painted a picture so disturbing it sent regulators into overdrive. Donations had collapsed from $13 million just a few years earlier to barely $2.1 million. Yet expenses ballooned to over $5.1 million. And the most shocking detail? Only a fraction of that money went toward actual charitable grants. The rest vanished into administrative costs, salaries, security, and operational overhead. To investigators, it didn't look like a charity struggling. It looked like something else entirely, something structured more like a private enterprise wearing a charitable mask. Then came the revelation that made insiders gasp. 2 employees, just 2. Yet together, they earned nearly $1 million in salaries. For a foundation whose charitable output was shrinking, whose donor trust was fading, whose public image was already under strain, those numbers weren't just suspicious, they were explosive. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the collapse of American Riviera Orchard. Because while the brand projected the illusion of overwhelming demand, forensic analysis told a different story. Warehouses across North America were filled with unsold inventory worth over $23 million. Fruit preserves stacked untouched, marmalade jars collecting dust, tea sachets sitting in silence. And during one promotional event tied directly to Meghan herself, only 26 units sold in an entire day. 26. Not 26,000. Not even 2,600. Just 26. Think about what that means. The narrative of instant sellouts, the glowing media coverage, the perception of unstoppable success. It wasn't reality, it was projection, it was performance. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate and decisive. Emergency meetings, legal consultations, strategic briefings. The royal institution wasn't just protecting itself anymore, it was building a firewall. Because if regulators concluded that Meghan had used royal association to influence donors or consumers, the implications wouldn't just affect her, they would affect the crown itself. And Prince William knew that. When he sat down with IRS officials behind closed doors, sources say his message wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was cold, precise, and devastating. He made it clear that the royal family was not a marketing tool, that titles were not commodities, that the crown was not an accessory to private enterprise. In that moment, something shifted forever. This wasn't family conflict anymore. This was institutional survival. Meanwhile, Meghan's empire began to fracture in real time. Retail partners quietly suspended agreements. Distribution channels froze. Warehouses refused additional storage over payment concerns. And then came the most telling move of all, her website went dark. Officially, it was technical maintenance. Unofficially, insiders described it as damage control. Because when federal investigators circle, silence becomes strategy. Behind the scenes, legal notices were delivered. Cease and desist orders were issued. Compliance reviews intensified. Regulators examined whether royal symbolism had been used intentionally to enhance credibility, increase sales, and attract donors. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the picture became. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about trust. It was about perception. It was about whether the power of the crown had been transformed into something transactional. And as the investigation deepened, Meghan Markle found herself facing something no royal fairy tale ever prepared her for. Not public criticism, not tabloid speculation, but institutional scrutiny backed by legal authority. The Duchess, who once redefined modern royalty, was now confronting a reality far colder, far more unforgiving. Because in the world of federal investigations, charm doesn't matter. Image doesn't matter. Only evidence matters. And evidence, it seemed, was beginning to speak. By the time the investigation reached its boiling point, Meghan Markle was no longer controlling the narrative was controlling her. The carefully curated illusion of effortless success, the polished image of independence, the branding soaked in legacy and symbolism, it all began collapsing under the weight of something far more dangerous than rumors, documented scrutiny. Because when federal investigators start tracing financial patterns, examining branding decisions, and dissecting language used in public and donor communications, every word becomes evidence, every decision becomes motive, and every symbol becomes a potential liability. And that's exactly what was happening. Behind closed doors, Archewell's sudden restructuring raised alarm bells so loud they couldn't be ignored. In June 2025, the foundation quietly shifted into a fiscal sponsorship model, essentially placing itself under another nonprofit's umbrella. On paper, it sounded harmless, strategic, administrative, but investigators saw something else entirely. Timing. Because this shift didn't happen during a period of growth or expansion. It happened when scrutiny intensified, when media questions multiplied, when donor trust started evaporating. To regulators, it didn't look like evolution. It looked like concealment. The implications were chilling. This move dramatically reduced public visibility into Archewell's financial disclosures. It shielded detailed reporting. It obscured transparency. And investigators began asking the question that haunted every conversation: was this a calculated attempt to avoid scrutiny? Inside the palace, the response was swift and ruthless in its precision. Legal teams didn't hesitate. Compliance officers didn't delay. New internal policies were drafted with one unmistakable goal: complete institutional separation. Because the monarchy wasn't just distancing itself from Meghan emotionally anymore, it was severing symbolic ties legally, structurally, and publicly. And then came the moment that insiders describe as the emotional breaking point. Prince William made something painfully clear. Titles, he insisted, were not assets. They were not shields. They were not tools for profit. They were duties, sacred, symbolic, and bound by responsibility. Those words weren't just philosophical. They were surgical. Because Meghan had continued using the Duchess of Sussex title across branding, media, and commercial ventures, reinforcing an association that regulators were now questioning with relentless intensity. To the public, it may have seemed like semantics, but to investigators, it was leverage. And leverage changes everything. Evidence began to accumulate: packaging comparisons, archived speeches, promotional language dripping with royal royal implication. Internal warnings previously sent by palace officials urging the removal of certain imagery and phrases. The pattern was undeniable. The palace hadn't stayed silent because it approved. It had stayed silent while documenting everything. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, Meghan's commercial empire was unraveling faster than anyone expected. Major retailers began suspending distribution agreements. Warehouses refused to continue storage over financial concerns. Inventory piled up like physical evidence of a narrative that had lost its credibility. And as American Riviera Orchard's website disappeared into digital darkness, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't expansion. This was retreat. But the true nightmare wasn't financial collapse. It was legal escalation. Because once fraud review enters the conversation, the stakes transform completely. This wasn't about public opinion anymore. This was about whether Meghan's ventures had crossed the line from ambitious branding into deliberate misrepresentation. Whether royal symbolism had been used not as inspiration, but as influence. Whether donors and consumers had been led to believe something that wasn't entirely true. Behind the scenes, investigators requested contracts, communications, approval records, and partnership documentation. They wanted proof of intent, proof of authorization, proof of awareness. And every day that passed without clear answers intensified the pressure. Inside the monarchy, preparations were already underway for something unprecedented, a formal review of Meghan's continued use of her title. Legal advisors examined constitutional precedent. Compliance officers evaluated symbolic neutrality doctrine. The question wasn't just whether Meghan had misused royal association. The question was whether that misuse justified something historic, revocation. For Meghan, the personal implications were devastating because her identity, her brand, her influence had all been built around the mystique of royalty even after leaving royal duties behind. That symbolic connection had been her foundation, her leverage, her distinction. And now that foundation was under threat. Simultaneously, Archewell faced the possibility of losing its nonprofit status entirely. Penalties loomed, civil consequences, public disclosure requirements that could expose internal communications and operational strategies to relentless examination. The carefully controlled narrative could be replaced by something far less forgiving, documented truth. What made the situation even more explosive was the emotional dimension. This wasn't just institutional conflict, this was family, brother against brother, legacy against reinvention, tradition against transformation. Prince William's actions weren't fueled by personal anger, they were driven by institutional preservation. Because from his perspective, this wasn't about punishing Meghan. It was about protecting the monarchy itself, protecting its meaning, protecting its credibility. And credibility, once damaged, is almost impossible to restore. As global attention intensified, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. The Duchess, who once redefined modern royalty, was now facing the possibility of losing the very title that gave her influence. The foundation created to represent compassion and service was now under investigation for financial imbalance. The lifestyle brand built on legacy and elegance was drowning in unsold inventory and vanishing partnerships. Everything that had once elevated Meghan was now becoming evidence against her. But perhaps the most haunting realization wasn't financial or legal. It was psychological. Because for years, Meghan had fought to escape the constraints of royal life, to redefine herself on her own terms, to build something independent and powerful. And she succeeded, temporarily. She built visibility. She built influence. She built a narrative of empowerment. But narratives, no matter how powerful, cannot outrun investigation. And now, as federal scrutiny deepened, as institutional separation intensified, as legal consequences loomed closer than ever before, Meghan Markle found herself standing at the center of something far more unforgiving than royal tradition: accountability. The fairy tale that once captivated millions had transformed into something darker, something colder, something brutally real. The illusion of untouchable royalty had evaporated, replaced by the reality that titles cannot shield anyone from scrutiny, not from institutions, not from evidence, not from consequence. And as the investigation continued, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just the fall of a brand, it was the unraveling of an identity. Because when the crown draws its line, when the institution chooses survival over sentiment, when legacy chooses preservation over loyalty, there is no negotiation left, only aftermath.